We have Bruce Smallfield here. Bruce is from the Plant and Food Research, and he is going to be speaking about his work in new and novel crops for the Upper Taieri. So welcome along, Bruce, and I can forward your slides if you like.
So you can just point when I want to.
Yeah, you just look at me and I'll change the slide for you.
When I was offered to talk, I realised that I was coming to a sheep and beef area, but there's actually connections with horticulture within this region. I'd just like to say that when I started my career over 42 years ago now, sheep, beef, dairy, all those farmers were suffering from withdrawal of subsidies and everything like that, and were looking for alternatives. So we have actually come full cycle in terms of my career, in terms of farmers looking at diversification and opportunities. And the New Crops program actually developed, that I've been involved with for 37 years now, came out of that desire from farmers to look at new opportunities and what they could do with property, sheep and beef properties, dairy properties that were no longer profitable. So I just wanted to mention quickly that this is actually a bit of a rehash of what I did for the Strath Taieri. The Strath Taieri were interested in 2005-2006. We're interested in land use diversification to justify irrigation, and Kate's here today. And part of that, the work really centres around the new crops research that was done at Red Bank Research Station at Clyde. It's actually at Earnscleugh. So there's relevance for the crops that could be grown in this environment because it's semi-continental similar, but you're another 200 metres altitude that you're dealing with here. I'd also point out that since leaving Invermay, I've also worked in the Culverden area with my tahu and looking at land use opportunities for the Balmoral Forest property, and have been working with our Land and Water and the Waimakariri catchment looking at land use change opportunities currently. In terms of the Strath Taieri, and I'll just present these, we looked at a range of crop options, and we were really looking, rather than mainstream crops, we were really looking at the full range of things that could be grown. There were 9 tree species, fruit crops developed, 4 nut crops, which include hazels, which you're interested to see you have another speaker. There were 23 essential oil crops that were evaluated as part of the program at Red Bank, 38 species of herb and medicinal plants, ornamental species, and arable crops. And the arable crops and seed crops really relate often to the essential herbs and medicinal crops, just seed production. Also, my very first introduction to new crops was actually a chamomile trial here out at the White Sour Valley, where they were interested in growing chamomile for tea, and we were interested in essential oils. And subsequent to that, I've been involved with an arnica trial funded by the MAF Sustainable Farming Fund, and there was a very successful arnica production undertaken in the Maniototo. I think there's saffron, coriander, and another number of other crops that have been tried. I'll just quickly show the tables, but you'll be able to look later at the range of crops. So if you just sort of flick, first. So your soils are similar to, the sort of main types of soils are similar to what we were dealing with in Clyde, but as I said, your difference is that you've got another 200 metres of elevation. For what we did with the Strath Taieri, we listed a range of crops, whether they're annuals, perennials, or biennials, whether they needed water or not, and the products that could be produced, and the types of equipment or technical processing things that you need. So a range of crops, and I'd point out things like elder, which is actually considered a weed, as an opportunity to develop a novel fruit crop. if we go to the next one. Nut crops, again from the altitude, the 4 that stood out from our evaluation was hazel, pine nuts, sweet chestnuts and walnuts. And people talked about almonds and things like that, but almonds are one of the very earliest flowering of the prunus species, and I think in terms of your frost risk in this area, it's probably a no-go. But someone will prove me wrong and say I've got an almond tree in my backyard. Essential oil crops are really diverse, and I'll just point out a couple. So Angelica, think of gin as a flavouring. It also coriander is a flavouring in gin. I've listed chamomile there, which is a high value oil. Lavender, which again I would say is probably high risk in this region because of the risk of frost and taking out your flowers. And yeah, there's a range of essential oil crops, but this essential oils offers an opportunity for a small high value industry within a farming system. Keep going. Again, herbs and medicinals, ginseng is something that was tried at Red Bank and would probably grow here under a forest cover or natural shade, artificial shade, sorry. Very deep soils if you're thinking about a Japanese traditional vegetable. Burdock, which is also considered a weed in New Zealand. Marigolds or calendula did well up here. Saffron crocus, again. Saffron crocus is for someone that wants to spend their Easter picking flowers and on their hands and knees. Although you could produce, say, saffron corn. So again, that enjoyment factor is an important part in the type of crop that you're wanting to select. Next one. Ornamental crops, and I won't go into this because fashions change, and this was 2006, and so things change with time. And so this is a range that we selected at that time. Ornamentals may be an option for a small area of land within a larger farming system. And I know they were in the late 1990s, 2000s, they were growing peony here in the Maniototo near Waipiata. And we'll forget the arable seeds. There's a huge list of them, and as I say, possibly you'd have to be a specialist seed producer to think about arable seed production. Okay, Arnica montana, and why have I raised this? Well, we're in the region that actually Arnica did best in terms of our NAF Sustainable Farming Fund trials. And there was a trial done at Styx Creek at 720 metres of altitude. It produced the highest flower yields and the best survival of plants. Down here on the flat at Waipiata, was a different story because of the very dry conditions, and it resulted in lots of disease. The aims of the project were to identify where Arnica would grow in New Zealand, and perhaps I should say that Arnica is an anti-inflammatory medicinal herb of European origin. Things like anti-flam, you're probably aware of, sport rubs and things like that. The major source of Arnica in the world is actually from Europe, and it comes from Romania and Spain, and is harvested from the wild by Romanov people that move through the region, just collecting from the wild. And the problems that the medicinal herb producers or processors are facing is it's dependent on wild populations. There's loss of habitat and overexploitation of that wild population. There's now controls in place because the plant's on the red list. And when we were doing this project, we saw that there was probably an opportunity for about 120 tonnes of Arnica flowers, which is a lot of flowers, and potentially a very high value turn from Arnica. We produced a grower's guide and did a gross margin. If someone's interested in looking at that, that's for MPI. And the gross margin was done to work out how much it would cost a farmer to actually grow the crop and get an idea of value. Since the Ukraine war and COVID, supply again in Europe is in very short supply, and I've had people calling from Spain wanting material again. If we go on with Annika, so this is Waipiata in the first year, Styx Creek, and we were interested in how you control weeds. I think in the end that the trialists worked out that if they turned the ewes in the early spring, winter, they could eat the weeds and they didn't have to spend a lot of time weeding. And then Arnica is basically a daisy flower that is picked. And we worked out that yes, hand harvesting is probably a good option, but you could also mechanically harvest. If we go on. In terms of medicinal herbs and things like Arnica, it's the quality of the extract that is important, and there are chemical fingerprints that they want to see there, and they don't want to see contaminants like some other yellow flower like Kalinga that's thrown in. And the reason that they liked New Zealand Arnica and that Styx Creek was probably the highest quality Arnica that they ever saw was because there was no contamination, and there was a breed cultivar that was used for those trials. There was also, we worked out, that where the highest levels were, and by eliminating the sort of stems, you could up the quality of the plant material. So I've gone from medicinal herb to edible fungi now, and another connection with the Maniototo or Naseby. And there's growing interest in edible fungi from the sort of meat substitute within the diet. And the reason that I've chosen Shoro here, or New Zealand Shoro, is because it's growing wild at Naseby, and probably a lot of people don't know about it. I think there was an article several years ago about trials in exporting to Japan, but it was a prized delicacy in Japan until production from the wild started to decline, and they had difficulty of supply, and now I think in Japan it's all cultivated. But it represents a fungal species, an autumn fungal species that can be harvested in a low-cost system, a forestry system. So it might fit with the ETS. If you're interested in carbon farming, you could also you can have two-tier farming because unlike nut crops and things like that, where you can't claim the carbon credits, we understand with edible farming you could claim the carbon credits and also harvest mushrooms. The interesting thing, they look a bit like a small puffball, but they've got this sort of very red sort of outer layer that's important in Japan, as well as this very extreme white sort of dense mycelium in the middle. So there were trials done at Invermay to inoculate plants and try to cultivate them, and the first successful trial was actually done in Nelson. They got fruiting bodies. We also imported in Crop and Food Days the Japanese Shoro, and there is slight difference. The one at Naseby is actually an American species. The mycologists that I've spoken to believe that unlike truffles, and everyone's probably heard of high value truffles, this is a sort of a low cost edible fungi option because you don't need the soil controls, the pH and the high requirements within the nursery to produce things like truffles versus something like Shoro. And the Shoro actually provides a benefit to the tree in terms of its mycorrhizal growth. There needs to be work in terms of identifying the market value, market potential, and to educate people on the fungus. But it's probably easier today than when we first started these trials, because we now have oyster mushroom and shiitake and all these other exotic mushroom, inukatake, being actually grown through waste products, using waste products in New Zealand. And there's currently no New Zealand yield information. But a resource like NASB would allow you to evaluate the fungus from the wild and to gain some of that information. I'd also point out that because it's an autumn fruiting fungus, that irrigation would probably improve the reliability of fruiting of this particular fungus. So I'm not saying plant truffles and that in this area if you talk about edible fungi. This is it's too cold for the likes of truffles. This is looking at another fungal option, and that's what I've mentioned New Zealand Chari today. As part of the analysis, we looked at strengths, weaknesses, and I won't go into any more of that. Just if we flick through, you can look at that at your leisure and consider it if you want. If we keep going. Okay, New Zealand natives was the other thing and the opportunity that New Zealand natives present in terms of producing plant products. And I've worked very closely with Ngāi Tahu and Puketeraki, in this case in the development of their product Mea, which is a perfume based on the traditionally harvested taramea or speargrass, or some farmers might know it as wild Spaniard. And you've often probably had an experience of sitting on it in the hill country. So this is very much a product developed for Ngāi Tahu, and we just provided the technical expertise and how it was done. But basically it's looking at the resin within the leaves that contains the perfume, and that can be easily extracted by steam distillation. Traditionally, Maori extracted it in weka fat or seal blubber or some other bird fat, and their method is actually analogous to the French enfleurage process that they now use for jasmine and flowers to extract that, and then it was worn as an amulet around the neck. And the nice thing about taramea is that the actual recipe is preserved in a waiata that describes the ingredients within that's used to produce the taramea perfume. And the use of a native, the important thing is the traditional story that's told. And I would stress that any native could be considered a taonga species, and working in association with iwi is an important thing if you're wanting to develop a native species. This is an alpine plant that generally grows above 700 metres, so we're not restricting ourselves to intensive horticulture in this case, but it is still horticulture. We go to the next one. Just in turn, and the reason that I wanted to put this in, as part of the work that we did with Ngāi Tahu, we were interested in working out the variation in essential oil yield, and we did a couple of transects. We came from, as well as in the Queenstown area, we did one over from Lake Onslow through to through Sticks Creek and over the Rock and Pillar along the Dunstan Trail. And the different colours you can see there represent the difference in oil yield. And they go from 0.19% up to 0.8%. This one plant here. They were individual plants that we analysed as part of a student project. And we thought, oh wow, this is really making progress. You know, we've got something that's really high yielding, and that is high yielding for the essential oil. But when we looked at the chemical composition of that plant, it was mainly one particular compound, and so it didn't have the complexity of a taramea oil that you'd think about for perfume. And the reason that I put this up is that in all novel crops, even if you're dealing with natives or lesser known crops, you need to think about the germplasm, the diversity of the germplasm that you're wanting to try and access. If you're thinking about going into something, don't just stick to trialling one variety to start with. You need to recognise that there's a lot of variability within germplasm, and you need to evaluate that. And that's proved the same with Manuka. The work that I did throughout New Zealand identified 12 different chemotypes of Manuka, and the high-value antibiotic chemotype only occurs on the East Cape. The stuff around here is completely different. So quickly, if I was thinking about crops in this region, the sort of annual rainfall, annual temperature, and that is probably well defined, and I wouldn't worry about that. I'd be more concerned in my evaluation to understand the frequency and intensity of out of season frosts. And in this environment, you can have, as we heard today, you can have a frost at any time of the year. So you've got to think about, are the species that I'm interested in able to cope with that frost? And that would be where I'd concentrate first. If you've got access to irrigation water, you're less worried about the need for, say, rainfall. Rainfall becomes less critical. You can also select species that are don't require rainfall. The other thing, enjoyment, has been spoken about before, and I always say start at the market opportunity end, don't start at the plant that I've heard this makes a lot of money so I want to grow it. You've got to understand something that's interesting to you and meets your objectives. So as I've mentioned earlier, if you're not interested in being on your hands and knees picking saffron flowers, understanding that first means you'd probably write that off. But if you're interested in, say, tree species, there's a range of nut crops and things. So understanding the markets that are of interest to you and the types of crops and the way that they're growing is the starting point that I advocate, and then sift out of that the returns and the economics of those crops. The other important thing where you're talking about new and novel or minor crops is, and if someone, or you hear on the media about a particular crop and you say that's interesting, the first place that I go is the MPI Plants Biosecurity Index to identify whether that plant is actually present in New Zealand. If it wasn't present in 1995, then the cost of bringing that plant material in is much higher than anything else, because you've got to develop an import standard for that plant material. It's not impossible. I think when we were first looking at it, we were looking at $30,000. It could be much higher than that now. But once one person does an import standard, then it's available for everyone else. But check that it's grown in New Zealand, and you'll be quite surprised at the range of plant material that's out there in New Zealand and been trialled before. If I'm looking at this environment, my crop pick is whatever market sector you're interested in is, the continental. This is a semi-continental environment, very cold winters, hot dry summers. And therefore that would be my starting point in selecting the crops of interest. In terms of minor or novel crops, there's limited germplasm generally available, and they're generally just material that's harvested from the wild, so you can't expect a envy apple type plant, nice and uniform, and you can predict how it's going to happen. The plants will be highly variable, and so you're starting off with something that hasn't really been bred and improved. That presents an opportunity, but also long term, but it's also a disadvantage in terms of when you're trying to grow something and grow it uniformly. The technical knowledge is often limited, and there's been work done on a huge range of crops at Redbank. But a lot of that information has come from overseas or from trial from one location, and therefore if you're going to start with a minor crop or a novel crop, starting in a trialled way rather than planting 10 hectares and saying we're all on is the way that stage development, I think, is what I'd say. The other thing is that to expect that you're going to have to develop your own markets. So there's not a sheep buyer waiting at your gate to take your arnica or your hazelnuts or whatever. You know, there's no infrastructure locally, so you are really starting as like a cottage industry. I believe native species within New Zealand do offer an opportunity, but please recognise that they're Tonga species and there's an expectation that development would involve an iwi partner, and that's the policy that PFR operates under. I think that's it, but if we just go to, there's another slide at the end that I put this in. I wasn't sure whether anyone was going to talk about tree crops today, and one of the crops that I think could have an opportunity for this region is maple syrup or other syrup tree crops. And there's actually Matthew Watson at University of Canterbury. He's actually an engineer with an interest in horticulture. Is quite amazing, but he's actually done a lot of work on evaluating maple syrup for New Zealand and the opportunities. This may work for someone like a dairy farmer that understands vacuums and vacuum systems, because that's the sort of technology that they're investigating. It may also fit with hedgerows, because they're now talking about a productive system that involves coppicing rather than waiting 10 to 20 years for the maple trees to grow. And it was one of the reasons that we didn't include maple as part of our initial new crops trials, was because of the time involved in waiting till you start to come to production. So I'll leave it there. That's pretty quick once over, but I really just wanted to emphasise the opportunity that sits outside of mainstream, crops that we think of in New Zealand.
Have you had anything to do with horehound? Is there any good that can come out of that?
Horehound, I think there is probably a medicinal used in horehound.
There's a trial at the Central Otago Polytech Horticultural.
Yeah, so there are a lot of weeds that have medicinal use. I was involved with rosehip production opportunity in Twizel. That didn't go ahead in the end because the developers could earn more from turning irrigated land, dry land into irrigated land, than the cost the final, basically the cost of developing the rosehip production. But rosehip is actually a very valuable medicinal plant, particularly the shells in Northern Europe, and quite widely known. Obviously we use rosehip oil. Most of that's harvested from South Africa, Chile, here in New Zealand for facial creams and things like that.
Bruce, you talked about the fungi.
Yeah.
Would that work in shelter belts around farms? Does it have to be the Pinus radiata?
I think, as far as I know, it's grown on larch, and I don't know whether it could be Douglas fir Naseby. Pinus radiata was the only one that they trialled it in terms of trials. Yes, it could be grown in shelter belts, but you'd want to protect the trees from stock. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what trampling underneath the trees would do to the fruiting bodies. There's another edible fungi, saffron milkcap, that also trialled, that's a bit further along, and that's also grown on different pine species, like Pinus pinea, so they could have pine nuts.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's much better, because the other ones you're mentioning are wild and we don't particularly like those.
Yeah.